My name is Anthea Alice, and I am 32 years old. 5 years ago, my family threw me out in the rain with a single cardboard box. I spent 6 years building their luxury retail empire from the ground up, working 80-hour weeks while my brother played golf. But the night my parents named him CEO, his first act was firing me in front of 50 employees to, quote, trim the fat. They cut me off without a dime. They erased me from their lives. They told everyone I was a failure who lacked vision. For 5 years, I built a new life in silence. Then last month, my parents' company was on the verge of bankruptcy. They were drowning in debt and begged a mystery consultant to save their legacy. The day I walked into their boardroom and they realized the CEO they hired was the daughter they discarded, their faces went white as a sheet. Before I tell you exactly how I bought their future out from under them, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories, but only if you have ever been the family workhorse. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are watching from. I want to know who is listening tonight. Now let me take you back to a ballroom at the Oakmont Country Club and the exact moment my family decided I was disposable. The Alice Heritage Goods annual corporate retreat was supposed to be a celebration. My parents, Richard and Evelyn, had spent 3 decades building a high-end home retail chain. I was their operations manager. For 6 years, I negotiated vendor contracts at 3 in the morning. I managed the supply chain. I kept the business breathing. My older brother, Julian, held the title of Vice President of Development. His role mostly consisted of charging steak dinners to the corporate card and leaving early on Fridays. That night, beneath a crystal chandelier, my father tapped a silver spoon against his champagne flute. The room of 50 employees fell quiet. "We are entering a new era of modern luxury," my father announced. His tailored tuxedo caught the light as he smiled at the crowd. "Which is why Evelyn and I are stepping back. Effective immediately, Julian will be taking over as CEO." Applause echoed through the ballroom. I smiled and took a sip of water. I was already calculating how I would manage Julian and his inevitable logistical blind spots. Julian walked up and took the microphone. He adjusted the cuffs of his Tom Ford suit, a suit I had processed through accounting 3 weeks prior. He did not look at the crowd. He looked directly at my table. "My first act as CEO," Julian said. His voice was smooth and practiced, "is trimming the fat. We need visionaries, not spreadsheet managers. Anthea, your role is being eliminated tonight. Security will escort you to your desk to collect your personal items." Silence blanketed the room. 50 pairs of eyes shifted to me. My stomach dropped. I looked toward the head table. My mother was inspecting her manicure. My father took a slow sip of his champagne. I stood up. The legs of my chair scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. I walked over to my parents with my pulse thudding in my ears. "You are letting him fire me?" I asked. "After everything I built?" Richard finally met my gaze. His eyes were flat and devoid of any warmth. "You have always lacked vision, Anthea. You are a worker bee. Julian is the future of this brand. Do not make a scene on his big night." They cut me off right there. No severance, no recommendations, just a cardboard box and a walk out the back door. I stood shivering on the curb outside the country club, holding that single box. Rain drummed against the cheap cardboard, soaking through the bottom until the flaps began to give way. My thumb hovered over my phone screen, watching a digital car icon stall in traffic on the rideshare app. That was my lowest point, waiting in the dark while the people who shared my DNA toasted to my exit inside. They thought they broke me. They thought I would fade away. But what my family did not realize as I climbed into that damp car was simple. I did not just manage their spreadsheets. I knew all their secrets. After the taillights of that rideshare faded into the rainy Boston night, my real struggle began. I woke up the next morning on a deflated air mattress in a cramped, unheated studio apartment on the edge of the industrial district. The cold seeped through the thin floorboards, chilling my bones before I even opened my eyes. The walls were paper thin, carrying the sounds of sirens and shouting from the street below. I pulled out my phone and checked my banking app. The screen glowed with a cruel, unforgiving number. $400. That was my entire net worth. My parents had made sure I left the country club with zero severance pay. They locked me out of the corporate accounts before I even reached the parking lot, ensuring I had no safety net. I needed to know what they were telling the industry. I opened a business networking site, and there it was, a pristine, polished press release from Richard Alice. It stated that the company was undergoing an exciting leadership transition and that Anthea Alice was stepping away on a personal sabbatical to find herself. To find myself. The sheer audacity of that statement burned the back of my throat. They were painting my termination as a luxury vacation to protect their stock prices. They wanted the board members to think I was a spoiled daughter taking time off. Instead of a dedicated executive, they threw into the street. Hunger clawed at my stomach. I walked over to the tiny rusted kitchenette and boiled water for a 99-cent pack of ramen noodles. The steam warmed my freezing hands. While I waited for the noodles to soften, I made the mistake of checking a social media app. My feed refreshed, and a photo popped up from my sister-in-law, Jessica. She had married my brother Julian 3 years earlier. Jessica possessed no actual job skills, but she excelled at spending corporate capital with breathtaking speed. The photo showed her lounging on the deck of a chartered yacht in Monaco, holding a glass of vintage champagne. The caption read, "Celebrating Julian promotion and our new chapter." I stared at the screen. I recognized the designer handbag sitting on the deck chair next to her. It cost more than 4 months of my rent. That yacht, that champagne, that handbag were all funded by the vendor discounts I had ruthlessly negotiated at 3 a.m. My sweat and my 80-hour work weeks had bought my brother a European playground. A wave of anger so thick it felt like poison washed over me. The instinct to scream was overwhelming. I wanted to call my mother. I wanted to beg them to see reason to take me back, to acknowledge my worth to the family name. But I did not scream. I did not pick up the phone. Crying is what victims do, and begging is what losers do. I set my bowl of cheap noodles on a wobbly thrift store table, and I opened my battered laptop. I decided right then to weaponize my silence. They had stripped me of my title, my income, and my family. But they could not strip me of my financial brilliance. The Alice Heritage Goods empire survived because I knew how to restructure failing supply chains and bleed excess costs out of dying margins. I could do that for anyone. That afternoon, I paid a small filing fee and registered a new company, AA Apex Solutions. I positioned it as a boutique restructuring firm for failing retail chains. I knew the retail sector was bleeding cash across the country. Traditional brick-and-mortar stores were terrified of the changing market landscape. I also knew that corporate boards were notoriously sexist and hesitant to hand over total control to a 32-year-old woman with a recently tarnished reputation. So I removed myself from the equation entirely. I operated anonymously under my initials. AA became a ghost. My first client was a regional sporting goods chain, drowning in surplus inventory. I worked from my freezing studio, analyzing their ledgers late into the night while wearing a winter coat indoors. I found their financial leaks. I fired their bloated middle management teams. I renegotiated their warehouse leases using the same ruthless tactics I had perfected under my father. Within 3 months, they returned to profitability. They paid my firm a staggering contingency fee. I used that money to upgrade my software, buy a real desk, and hunt for bigger prey. Word of mouth is a dangerous and beautiful tool in the corporate underworld. Desperate business owners do not care what you look like or who your father is when the bank is threatening to foreclose on their properties. They only care if you can stop the bleeding. The legend of the mystery consultant AA began to spread. I became the phantom fixer who could walk into a dying empire, shatter the broken structures, and rebuild them into fortresses. To maintain the illusion, I hired a brilliant senior partner named David to be the public face of the firm. David was older, distinguished, and possessed a calm, authoritative voice. He attended the meetings. He shook the hands. But I pulled every single string from the shadows, reading the room through a secure audio feed. I spent 4 years turning Apex Solutions into an apex predator. I poured every ounce of my betrayal into my work. I did not take vacations. I did not go to parties. I built my own wealth, brick by brick. Meanwhile, I watched from afar as the Alice family paraded their unearned status across magazine covers and charity galas. Julian gave interviews boasting about his visionary leadership, while Alice Heritage Goods slowly began to fracture under his incompetence. I saw the cracks in their quarterly reports long before anyone else did. I knew Julian was spending too much and working too little. I knew the foundation was rotting. Fast forward to year 4. The unheated studio apartment was a distant memory. I now lived in a sleek penthouse overlooking the city skyline. I wore custom-tailored blazers and drank imported coffee on a private glass balcony. Apex Solutions had millions in operating capital. I had won. I had proven that I did not need the Alice name to conquer the world. I thought the desire for closure had faded away, leaving only the cold satisfaction of my own success. Then, the universe delivered the ultimate irony. It was a Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my glass desk reviewing a merger document when David sent an urgent notification to my private server. He forwarded an email that had just landed in the firm's secure inquiry box. I clicked the attachment with mild curiosity. The sender name was Richard Alice. I stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. I leaned closer to the monitor, tracing the letters of my father's name. The subject line read, "Urgent. Alice Heritage Goods restructuring needed." I opened the body of the email. It was not a proud corporate inquiry. It was a plea. My father outlined a catastrophic cash flow crisis. He wrote that traditional banks had refused their recent loan applications. He stated that the company required immediate, decisive intervention to avoid an impending bankruptcy filing. He was begging AA, Apex Solutions, to step in and save his legacy. He offered an exorbitant premium for our services, promising total cooperation. My family was drowning in an ocean of their own arrogance. They had fired the only person who knew how to steer their ship, and now they were taking on water fast. They reached out into the dark, looking for a life raft. They had no idea they had just asked the daughter they threw away to hold the keys to their survival. A slow, quiet smile spread across my face. I picked up my phone and dialed David's secure line. I told him we were going to take the meeting, but we were going to do it strictly on my terms. I was about to perform a financial autopsy on my own family. Seeing the people who discarded you beg a stranger for help is a surreal psychological experience. It is a specific type of vindication that tastes like copper. I sat in my penthouse office staring at the email from Richard Alice for a long time. The desperation in his syntax was palpable. He used words like urgent and critical. This was a man who never asked for directions, let alone salvation. I needed a proxy to interact with them. I summoned my senior partner, David, to my office. David was a 58-year-old veteran of corporate restructuring. He wore tailored Navy suits and spoke with a calm, measured baritone that commanded boardrooms. He looked like the kind of man my father would respect. An old-school executive. I briefed David on the target. I kept my voice detached. I told him Alice Heritage Goods was just another bleeding retail chain that needed a tourniquet. I did not disclose my blood tie. That was my leverage. I instructed David to reply to the inquiry. He was to establish dominance early. No promises, no guarantees, just a cold demand for their unfiltered financial ledgers to conduct a preliminary audit. The files arrived 24 hours later via a secure, encrypted link. Opening those ledgers was like walking into a crime scene. My father had always projected an image of meticulous control. He wore custom suits and hosted lavish charity dinners to maintain the illusion of endless prosperity. But numbers do not care about tailored wool or country club memberships. Numbers tell the brutal truth. For 3 consecutive days and nights, I locked myself in my office. I ordered black coffee and ran their raw data through my proprietary diagnostic software. The deeper I dug, the worse the decay became. During my 6-year tenure as operations manager, I fought tooth and nail to maintain a strict 20% profit margin. I tracked shipping container costs to the penny. Under Julian, that margin had evaporated. The balance sheets were a chaotic web of mismanaged accounts and duplicated expenses. I tallied their outstanding liabilities. The final number flashed red on my monitor. $4 million in debt. The commercial real estate loans securing their flagship stores were in default. The corporate credit lines were maxed out. They were running on fumes. Then I found the anomaly. It sat on line item 412 of the third quarter expense report, a vague entry labeled Strategic Marketing Outreach. The amount was $120,000. Retail marketing budgets do not move in single round number wire transfers. They are broken down into campaign sprints, media buys, and agency retainers. I highlighted the row. I traced the routing number through their outgoing bank statements. The money did not go to a public relations firm. It went to a high-end European auto import dealership downtown. Julian had used corporate operating capital to purchase a custom Porsche 911. He logged a luxury sports car as a marketing expense. The adrenaline sharpened my focus. The Porsche was the thread that unraveled the sweater. I spent the next 10 hours hunting my brother through the ledgers. The car was just the beginning. Julian was using the company as his personal piggy bank. He expensed luxury vacations to St. Bart's under the guise of international vendor research. He paid his private golf club dues from the payroll account. He was actively embezzling. Meanwhile, my parents, Richard and Evelyn, were either turning a blind eye or were too financially illiterate to notice their golden child was robbing them blind. They were so desperate to believe in his visionary leadership that they enabled their own destruction. The accounts payable ledger is what truly ignited my anger. These were not abstract numbers on a spreadsheet. These were the vendors I had spent 6 years cultivating. I saw the name of an artisanal furniture maker in Oregon who I had personally convinced to sign an exclusive contract with us. I saw the textile weavers in North Carolina who relied on our quarterly orders to pay their own staff. Small business owners who trusted the Alice name. Julian had stopped paying them 6 months ago. He ghosted their emails and ignored their calls while driving a car bought with the money he owed them. He was destroying innocent livelihoods to fund his ego. The bank had finally reached its limit. Hidden in a subfolder of legal correspondence, I found a formal notice of default from their primary lender. The bank was threatening foreclosure on all retail locations and the corporate headquarters. They had exactly 30 days before the assets would be seized and auctioned. 30 days before the Alice legacy turned to ash. My parents were backed into a corner. They sent a panicked follow-up email to David pleading for a lifeline. They offered Apex Solutions a staggering premium retainer, double our usual rate. They promised unrestricted access. They promised whatever it took to keep the doors open. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. The city lights glittered below. They wanted a savior, but I was not in the business of granting miracles. I was in the business of leverage. I called David back into my office. I told him we would accept the contract, but I was going to draft the terms myself. I spent the next 2 hours crafting a restructuring agreement that bordered on draconian. I did not just want a consulting fee. I wanted the keys to the kingdom. I wanted the power they stripped from me 5 years ago. The trap was buried in Section 4 of the document. If Apex Solutions took the job, we required total, unquestioned operational control over all company assets. The terms were brutal and unforgiving. We would have the power to freeze executive bank accounts immediately. We would have the authority to liquidate assets without board approval. We would hold veto power over every single financial decision Richard, Evelyn, and Julian made. In exchange for saving them from bankruptcy, my family would have to sign away their autonomy to a faceless ghost. They would become employees of the very firm they were hiring. I printed the contract and handed the thick stack of paper to David. He read through the stipulations and raised an eyebrow at the sheer severity of the terms, but he did not question my judgment. I instructed him to set up a video conference with the Alice Executive Board for the following morning. I wanted to watch them read the terms. I needed to see if their desperation would finally override their pride. Would their hubris blind them enough to sign their lives away to a stranger they had no idea was the daughter they threw out in the rain? Hubris acts as a powerful anesthetic. It numbs the human mind to impending danger, wrapping the ego in a warm blanket of delusion. At 9 a.m. on Thursday, I sat in the darkened interior of my penthouse office, watching that exact delusion unfold. 3 curved monitors illuminated my face with a cool blue glow. On the center screen, a high-definition video feed connected my senior partner, David, to the Alice Heritage Goods Executive Boardroom. The visual contrast between the two spaces told the entire story. David sat in our pristine, minimalist conference room, exuding the calm certainty of a predator that has already cornered its prey. On the other side of the digital divide, my family sat in their opulent, wood-paneled boardroom. Richard wore his signature charcoal pinstripe suit, sitting at the head of the long glass table. He projected the aura of a monarch holding court, rather than a debtor begging for a lifeline. Julian slouched in the leather chair to his right, casually scrolling on his smartphone, projecting an air of bored inconvenience. Evelyn sat on the left, her posture stiff, hands folded tightly in her lap. I muted my microphone and leaned back in my chair. I was a ghost, quietly observing my own haunting. David opened the meeting without pleasantries or soft introductions. He did not offer the typical consultant reassurances. He placed a thick, leather-bound folder on his desk and flipped it open. In his smooth, authoritative baritone, he outlined the brutal severity of their financial decay. He listed the $4 million in suffocating debt. He named the specific vendors preparing class action lawsuits for unpaid invoices. He detailed the looming commercial property seizures. Richard attempted to seize control of the narrative immediately. He waved a manicured hand dismissively, blaming macroeconomic market fluctuations and global supply chain disruptions. He used a barrage of corporate buzzwords to mask the reality of his son embezzling capital. "We just need a temporary injection of liquidity," my father declared, adjusting his silk tie. "A brief restructuring of our payable accounts to appease the board." We hired Apex Solutions to secure a bridge loan and manage the optics of this transition. David did not blink. "Apex Solutions does not manage optics, Richard. We manage survival." David clicked his mouse, sending a dense document file across the secure connection directly to their terminal. "Those are the non-negotiable terms of our engagement. Please direct your attention to Section 4. I watched the feed closely as Julian leaned forward, squinting at the large presentation screen on their wall. His casual, bored demeanor evaporated in an instant. Section 4 of my contract was designed to strip them bare. It demanded unconditional operational sovereignty. The document clearly stated that Apex would gain the immediate power to freeze corporate accounts, liquidate physical assets, and terminate executive personnel without requiring any board approval. We would hold veto power over every single transaction exceeding $100. We would own their checkbook, their hiring power, and their real estate decisions. Julian slammed his palm against the glass table. The sharp crack echoed through my studio speakers. "Are you out of your mind?" my brother shouted. His face flushed a dark, angry crimson. "You are consultants, not kings. You work for us. We dictate the terms of this recovery. You think we are handing over the keys to a $50 million retail empire to some faceless restructuring firm? $50 million. Julian still believed the brand held its peak valuation from 5 years ago. He was defending an illusion, fighting a phantom, to protect a treasure chest that he had already emptied. I typed a quick directive into the secure chat window on my right monitor. Hold the line. Let them panic. David adjusted his silver reading glasses and looked directly into the camera. You do not have a $50 million empire, Julian. You have a $4 million liability wrapped in a nostalgic logo. If you reject these terms, Apex withdraws our offer of representation immediately. You can explain your visionary leadership to the federal bankruptcy judge on Monday morning. Richard stepped in, attempting his classic intimidation tactic. He stood up, looming over the camera lens to physically dominate the digital space. I know how this game is played, David. Your mysterious CEO thinks they can squeeze us because we hit a temporary rough patch. Tell your boss that Richard Alice does not sign suicide pacts. We will find another firm by tomorrow. The silence that followed stretched tight enough to snap. I hovered my mouse over the end call button on my dashboard. I was entirely willing to sever the connection and let their empire burn to the ground if they refused to sign. But then, a fragile, trembling sound broke the heavy tension in the room. Julian, please stop talking. It was my mother. Evelyn had not spoken a single word since the call began. Her knuckles were bone white, gripping the edge of the glass table. Richard, sit down. My father glared at her, visibly shocked by the sudden insubordination. Evelyn ignored his silent warning. Her eyes were wide with a terror I had never seen her display. The bank called this morning, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the admission. The senior loan officer bypassed Julian and called my personal cell phone. They are drafting the foreclosure papers today. We do not have until Monday. We do not have another firm waiting in the wings. We have nothing. The remaining oxygen left the boardroom. Julian opened his mouth to argue, but no words materialized. The luxury sports cars, the Monaco yacht charters, the endless steak dinners, the bill had finally arrived, and my mother was staring right at the total. They were backed into a corner of their own making. Desperation finally overrode their immense pride. I watched Richard clench his jaw tightly. He looked back at the digital contract on the screen. I knew his psychology intimately. He was a man who survived by manipulating leverage. He was currently calculating the angles, rationalizing the defeat. In his mind, signing this document was just a temporary concession. He likely believed that once the immediate financial crisis passed, he could charm, threaten, or buy his way out of the binding agreement. He assumed the unseen CEO of Apex Solutions was just another ambitious corporate drone he could eventually control. He had no idea the architect of this specific trap was immune to all of his tricks. With a heavy, defeated sigh, Richard reached into his breast pocket and extracted a gold fountain pen. He pulled a printed copy of the signature page toward his chest. The scratching of the metal nib against the thick paper echoed sharply through the microphone. He held the signed document up to the camera, his face a mask of bitter resentment. "You have your operational control," he said through gritted teeth. "Now fix my company." David captured the high-resolution image on his end. The meeting concluded shortly after. A moment later, the encrypted scan landed in my private inbox. I downloaded the file, maximizing it on my center monitor. I traced my father's jagged signature with my cursor. The ink was barely dry, but the transfer of power was legally binding and ironclad. They had just handed the entire Alice family legacy, their life work, and their future over to the daughter they once threw into the street. I did not waste a single second celebrating the milestone. Sentimentality is a vulnerability in business. I closed the video feed software and opened the dedicated terminal connected to the corporate banking portal. Now that Apex held total verified financial authorization, I bypassed their internal security protocols. I navigated directly to the executive expense management dashboard. I pulled up the active profiles for Richard, Alice, Evelyn, Alice, and Julian, Alice. My fingers hovered over the mechanical keyboard. The satisfying click of the keys filled my quiet office as I typed my very first executive order into the mainframe. I did not issue a warning. I did not send a polite email detailing new company policies. I executed a hard system override. Freeze all executive credit cards immediately. I hit the Enter key. The system processed the command. 3 green status icons on my screen flickered for a brief second before turning a cold, permanent red. The financial guillotine had dropped. Now all I had to do was wait for the golden boy to try and buy his next round of drinks. The trap snapped shut precisely at 8 o'clock on a Friday evening. For the Alice family, Friday nights were not just the end of the work week. They were a stage. Julian and his wife Jessica treated the Boston social scene as their personal kingdom. They maintained their elite status through a very specific kind of generosity, the kind funded entirely by someone else. Julian loved to pick up the tab. He thrived on the admiration of his peers when he covered courtside seats or ordered vintage champagne. It was easy to look like a benevolent king when you were spending money you never earned. Tonight was supposed to be his victory lap. He had invited Jessica and 6 of their wealthiest friends to Le Rêve, a notoriously exclusive Michelin star restaurant downtown. I knew his itinerary because I still monitored his digital calendar. He booked the private dining alcove. He told his guests he was celebrating a strategic corporate triumph. He spun a brilliant tale about hiring a boutique consulting firm to handle the tedious logistical details of his retail empire, while he focused on visionary leadership. He wanted them to believe he was ascending to a new level of power. The dinner stretched for 3 luxurious hours. They consumed rare Wagyu beef, imported truffles, and multiple bottles of French wine. At the end of the meal, the head waiter presented a discreet, leather-bound folio containing the bill. The total was nearly $3,000. Julian did not even glance at the itemized receipt. He performed his favorite trick. He casually tossed his black corporate credit card onto the silver tray without breaking eye contact with the guest seated across the table. It was a practiced, effortless move designed to project limitless wealth. The waiter offered a polite nod and walked away. 5 minutes later, the waiter returned. The silver tray held the black card, but the leather folio was still open. The server leaned down and whispered a few quiet words into my brother's ear. That was the pebble, the exact microsecond of raw, unfiltered humiliation. Julian froze. His tailored shoulders stiffened. He looked down at the plastic rectangle sitting on the tray. Declined. Jessica paused mid-sentence, holding a crystal wine glass near her lips. The other guests stopped talking. The silence in the alcove grew suffocating. Julian forced a tight, artificial smile. He passed. The waiter returned 2 minutes later with the same grim expression. Declined again. The humiliation spread across Julian's face like a physical rash. The golden child was being denied in front of his chosen audience. One of his friends, feeling uncomfortable with the shifting dynamic, discreetly pulled out a platinum card and covered the check. Julian muttered breathless apologies about administrative glitches, promising to wire the funds by Monday morning. He excused himself from the table and rushed toward the exit. He burst through the heavy brass doors of the restaurant into the cool night air. His hands shook as he dialed the private concierge line for the corporate bank. He demanded immediate authorization. He demanded to speak with a manager. The banking representative offered a polite but firm response. "Sir, your account access has been revoked by the controlling financial entity. We cannot override the restriction." Julian hung up the phone. Panic set in. He dialed the Apex Solutions emergency contact number. I had anticipated this exact sequence of events. I instructed David to route all executive communications through my private server. I sat in the quiet darkness of my penthouse office, watching the city skyline and listening to the live audio feed. David answered on the second ring. His voice resembled glacial ice. It was smooth, flat, and devoid of any empathy. "David, pick up the phone," Julian hissed into the receiver. His breath sounded ragged through the speaker. "There is a glitch in the merchant processing system. I'm standing on the sidewalk outside Le Rêve, and my cards are declining. Fix this right now. call the bank and authorize the charge." "Good evening," Julian David replied. "I'm afraid I cannot do that." "What do you mean you cannot do that?" Julian demanded. His pitch elevated, betraying his mounting terror. "You are the restructuring consultant. You work for me. I just signed your retainer yesterday. Fix the card before I walk back inside and look like a fool in front of my wife." "You did not sign a retainer," David corrected him. "You signed an operational surrender. There is no bank glitch. The CEO of Apex has terminated all vanity expenses effective immediately. Your corporate card is permanently revoked." The silence on the line was profound. I could almost hear the gears grinding in my brother's head. He had spent his entire life insulated from the word no. Our parents built a fortress of affirmation around him, praising his every mediocre idea. Now, a faceless entity had shattered his walls. "Are you insane?" Julian shouted. The volume peaked on my audio waveform monitor. "You cannot freeze my assets. I am the vice president of development. My father is the chairman of the board. You are a hired gun. I will have you fired by Monday morning. I will drag your firm into court and sue you for breach of contract. Turn the card back on." I swirled the remaining Cabernet in my glass. The empty threats were delicious. Julian possessed no legal standing, no leverage, and no understanding of the document he had signed. He was a man swinging a toy sword at a hurricane. "You do not have the authority to fire us, Julian," David stated. The calm delivery contrasted sharply with the frantic energy on the other end of the line. "Check your contract. Section 4 grants Apex full discretionary control over all corporate accounts. Your title holds no financial weight. I suggest you find another way to cover your dinner bill. Have a pleasant evening." David disconnected the line. The recording ended with the hollow tone of a dead signal. I sat back in my leather chair. The panic in his voice was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It was not just the fear of a man who could not pay for an expensive meal. It was the existential dread of a narcissist, realizing his charm could no longer alter reality. He had finally hit a solid wall. The limitless well of the Alice family fortune was sealed shut, and I was the one holding the concrete mixer. But I knew Julian better than anyone else on earth. A cornered animal does not simply accept defeat. When my brother faced failure, his immediate instinct was always to find a human shield. He would never confess to Jessica or his wealthy friends that he had mismanaged the company into ruin. He would never admit that he surrendered control of their wealth to a mystery consultant because he was drowning in debt. His fragile ego required a target. He needed someone to blame for the missing millions, to explain away his sudden lack of funds. He needed a villain to present to the extended family and the board of directors. As I finished my wine, I realized exactly who he was going to blame. He was going to point his finger at the daughter who was not there to defend herself. The Alice family rumor mill was about to spin up, and they were preparing to drag my name through the mud one last time. When toxic individuals lose their grip on reality, they do not self-reflect. They manufacture a new narrative. They need a villain to explain their sudden misfortune because acknowledging their own failures would shatter their fragile egos. Julian could never admit to his social circle that a restructuring firm cut up his credit cards due to his gross incompetence. My parents, Richard and Evelyn, could never admit to their wealthy peers or their board of directors that their golden boy had driven the Alice family legacy into a mountain of debt. They needed a scapegoat to explain the missing millions. They needed a target who was not in the room to defend herself. Saturday morning arrived with a gray, overcast sky reflecting the cold concrete of the city below my penthouse windows. I was standing at my kitchen island holding a warm mug of black espresso. The weekend usually offered a quiet reprieve from the relentless pace of corporate restructuring. But peace is a fragile illusion when you are dealing with a cornered animal. My personal cell phone vibrated against the marble countertop. I glanced at the screen. The caller identification displayed the name Rebecca. She was a distant cousin on my father's side. I had not spoken to her in over 3 years. During my 6-year tenure at Alice Heritage Goods, Rebecca always treated me with a mild, condescending pity. She viewed me as the overworked spinster of the family, while she attended Julian lavish holiday parties. I opened the message. The text consisted of a single probing sentence. "Hey, Anthea, is it true you stole money from your parents before you left?" I stared at the glowing screen. A familiar, sickening twist knotted deep in my stomach. It was the exact same visceral reaction I used to feel during my childhood whenever something broke in the house, and my parents instantly turned their glaring eyes toward me. I set my ceramic mug down on the counter. My pulse quickened. The sheer audacity of the accusation forced the breath from my lungs. I did not reply to Rebecca. Instead, I walked straight to my home office and booted up my secure workstation. I needed to see how far the poison had spread. Because Apex Solutions now held total operational sovereignty over the Alice network, I possessed unrestricted access to their internal email servers and private communications. I ran a targeted keyword search through my parents' outgoing messages from the past 12 hours. The results populated my screen in a cascading waterfall of betrayal. The narrative they were spinning was staggering in its cruelty. Richard and Evelyn were actively telling our entire extended family and their primary private investors that the current cash flow crisis was not a result of declining sales or poor management. They were claiming they had just uncovered a sophisticated, long-term embezzlement scheme. They were telling everyone that their disgruntled former operations manager had secretly drained the corporate reserve accounts 5 years ago. They were blaming me. I opened an email my mother had sent to her country club social circle. Evelyn wrote paragraphs detailing how heartbroken she was by my supposed betrayal. She claimed that I funneled millions into offshore shell companies right before they were forced to terminate my employment. She even referenced my current success, pointing to my consulting firm and my lifestyle as undeniable proof of my theft. She told her friends that Julian was working tirelessly to salvage the broken pieces I left behind. They were framing me for a felony to protect the son who was currently robbing them blind. They were preparing to offer me up as a sacrificial lamb to their angry creditors. The urge to fight back was overwhelming. A hot, blinding anger rushed into my chest. I picked up my phone and dialed my mother's private cell number. I wanted her to answer. I wanted to scream into the receiver. I wanted to ask her how she could sleep in her lavish bed knowing she was feeding her own daughter to the wolves. I wanted to demand an explanation for why my loyalty was rewarded with exile, while my brother's thievery was rewarded with protection. My thumb hovered over the green call icon. My heart hammered against my ribs. Then I stopped. I closed my eyes and took a long, slow breath until the heat in my chest cooled into a sharp, icy focus. I deleted the digits from my screen. Screaming is what victims do. Begging for fairness from people who inherently view you as disposable is a waste of oxygen. When you engage with a smear campaign emotionally, you validate the false narrative. You give them the erratic, hysterical reaction they need to prove you are unhinged. I refuse to play the role they wrote for me. Strategists do not scream. Strategists gather data. I set my phone aside and turned my full attention back to my curved monitors. I did not engage with the rumors. I did not reply to Rebecca or any of the other cousins who began flooding my inbox with fake concern and hidden accusations. I let them whisper in the dark. I focused entirely on the light of hard, undeniable mathematics. I spent the next 48 hours building a digital fortress. I named the project the Julian Audit. It was a meticulous, chronological compilation of every single stolen dollar my brother had taken from the company since the day they named him Chief Executive Officer. I did not rely on summaries or estimates. I pulled the raw routing numbers. I documented the fake vendor accounts Julian created to funnel cash directly into his personal portfolio. I downloaded the forged receipts he used to justify international vacations for his wife, Jessica. I compiled the payroll records showing ghost employees who collected generous monthly salaries that were immediately transferred into Julian private holding accounts. I attached the purchase orders for the country club dues, the tailored suits, and the custom imported sports car. But I did not stop at Julian. A parasite cannot thrive without a willing host. I expanded the audit to include my parents. I documented every single time Richard signed off on a fraudulent expense report without reviewing the attached documentation. I pulled the email threads where the accounting department attempted to warn Evelyn about the missing funds, only for her to dismiss their concerns and threaten their jobs for questioning her son. I built an irrefutable paper trail of enabled lies and willful ignorance. By Sunday night, my eyes burned from staring at the bright screens, but the execution dossier was complete. The Julian audit was a masterclass in forensic accounting. It contained zero emotion, zero speculation, and zero room for debate. It was pure, lethal truth. If they wanted to tell the world that a thief drained their empire, I was going to provide the investors with the exact name, routing number, and signature of the real criminal. I uploaded the final encrypted file to my secure cloud server. The Alice family thought they were playing a game of public relations. They thought they could control the narrative by being the loudest voices in the room. They had no idea they were sitting in a glass house, while I held a vault full of stones. But digital proof alone was not enough to satisfy the debt they owed me. Showing an investor a spreadsheet would ruin their future, but it would not address the arrogant entitlement they still carried in the present. They still believed they were royalty walking the halls of a kingdom they no longer owned. They needed to feel the loss of their power physically. They needed to watch their symbols of status be stripped away in broad daylight. I sent a late-night message to my senior partner, David. I told him to hire a private moving crew and a team of corporate security contractors for Monday morning. It was time to clear out the executive suite and let my brother watch his throne be carried out the front door. Monday morning arrived with crisp autumn sunlight filtering through my penthouse windows. The new work week signaled the next phase of the restructuring plan. The financial freeze I instituted on Friday night stopped the bleeding, but it did not solve the immediate cash deficit. Alice Heritage Goods owed their warehouse distribution staff 3 weeks of back pay. Dozens of working-class families were struggling to buy groceries because my brother prioritized his Michelin-star dinners over their hourly wages. The law dictates that employees must be compensated before any other corporate debt is settled. I decided to use this legal mandate as a highly precise scalpel. To meet payroll, we needed to generate immediate capital. I instructed my senior partner, David, to draft a formal liquidation order targeting all non-essential corporate assets. We were going to pay the warehouse staff by selling the executive furniture. When I managed the supply chain, my workspace consisted of a laminated particle board table wedged in a windowless hallway near the loading dock. I spent my days inhaling diesel fumes from delivery trucks and listening to the constant mechanical hum of the freight elevator. Meanwhile, Julian occupied the penthouse executive suite. His corner office featured floor-to-ceiling tempered glass walls, offering panoramic views of the Boston skyline. The centerpiece of his office was a custom mahogany desk. The piece was crafted from a single massive slab of imported wood and cost $15,000. Julian justified the exorbitant expense by claiming it projected strength to visiting vendors. In reality, it was a throne for a man who produced absolutely nothing. It was time to strip the golden child of his symbols of power. At 9 sharp, a team of bonded commercial freight movers, flanked by 2 private corporate security contractors, stepped off the top-floor elevator. I watched the entire sequence unfold in high definition from my personal monitor. Upon taking operational control, Apex Solutions had immediately upgraded the internal security feeds, giving me an unobstructed view of the executive floor. The moving foreman walked straight past the bewildered receptionist and approached the corner office. Julian was sitting behind his pristine wooden fortress, scrolling through his smartphone. The transparent glass walls of his office offered a perfect view to the 50 cubicle workers sitting in the open-plan bullpen outside. The foreman pushed open the heavy glass door and handed my brother the printed liquidation mandate. Julian barely glanced at the paper. He scoffed and waved his hand, dismissing the crew with the same arrogant flick of the wrist he used to order cocktails. The foreman did not move. He simply nodded to his team. Two large men wearing heavy work boots stepped forward and began unplugging the dual computer monitors resting on the expensive mahogany surface. The illusion of his untouchable status shattered in an instant. Julian leaped out of his ergonomic leather chair. He placed his hands flat on the polished wood, using his body to physically shield the furniture. He started shouting. His voice penetrated the glass walls, echoing across the silent floor. He threatened the movers with immediate lawsuits. He demanded they leave his property and threatened to call the police. The resulting scene was a spectacular collapse of composure. The employees in the bullpen stopped typing. Every single head turned toward the corner office. They watched their supposed visionary leader throw a temper tantrum over a piece of wood. The foreman crossed his arms and stated the facts in a bored, monotone voice. He explained that the property now belonged to the creditors. The security contractor stepped forward, reminding the chief executive officer that interfering with a court-mandated asset seizure would result in a police escort off the premises. Julian had a stark choice. He could step aside, or he could leave his own building in handcuffs. Red-faced and breathing heavily, Julian stepped away from the desk. The movers lifted the heavy mahogany slab, turning it sideways to maneuver it through the double doors. They stripped the room of the imported leather guest chairs, the rare artwork hanging on the walls, and the commercial-grade espresso machine sitting in the corner. Within 15 minutes, Julian stood in the center of an empty room. His computer monitors and scattered files sat in a pathetic, disorganized stack on the carpet. The golden child was left with nothing but empty space and the staring, judging eyes of the staff he had repeatedly failed. Removing the physical symbols of status sent a profound shockwave through the rest of the family. The frozen bank accounts were an abstract digital problem. Watching strange men carry a $15,000 desk onto a freight elevator was an undeniable reality. The panic shifted rapidly from my brother to my mother. Evelyn Alice realized the ghost consultants were immune to Richard's empty corporate threats and Julian temper tantrums. She decided to deploy her own specialized weapon. She chose to play the victim. Over the next 3 hours, Evelyn left 3 separate, frantic voicemails on the dedicated phone line assigned to David. The audio files were automatically routed to my secure, encrypted inbox. I sat at my desk sipping black coffee and listening to the unraveling of the family matriarch. In the first recording, Evelyn projected fierce outrage. She threatened to call the authorities, claiming the consulting firm was stealing cherished family property. She used words like dignity and respect, operating under the staggering delusion that those concepts applied to a business defaulting on millions in debt. By the second voicemail, the anger dissolved into performative tears. She cried about the horrific optics of the situation. She lamented how embarrassing the morning had been for her son. She focused entirely on the bruised ego of her child, while conveniently ignoring the fact that the warehouse workers could finally feed their families because that desk was gone. She wept for the loss of their public image, while remaining willfully blind to the decay beneath it. The third recording contained the ultimate demand. Her voice took on a sharp, desperate edge. She declared that the ruthless, unfeeling tactics of Apex Solutions were destroying the mental health of her family. She insisted that David arrange an emergency in-person meeting with the elusive chief executive officer. She demanded to look the mysterious AA in the eye. I knew exactly what my mother was planning. Evelyn survived high society by mastering the art of the maternal guilt trip. She believed that if she could sit across a boardroom table from this unknown corporate raider, she could humanize her family. She intended to wear her pearls, project a fragile, elegant vulnerability, and manipulate the stranger into restoring their access to the checkbook. She assumed AA was just another susceptible business person who would melt under the weight of a crying mother pleading for the survival of her legacy. I leaned back in my leather chair and let a slow, quiet smile spread across my face. The sheer poetic irony of her request tasted better than vintage wine. She wanted to use a motherly guilt trip on a stranger. She had no idea she was demanding an audience with the daughter she had erased from her memory. She was preparing a speech about family loyalty for the exact person she had thrown into the freezing rain 5 years ago. The time for hiding behind digital proxies and secure phone lines was over. The trap was fully constructed, the exits were sealed, and the audience was seated. They wanted to meet the ghost who dismantled their kingdom. I was finally ready to haunt them in broad daylight. I opened my encrypted email client. I bypassed my senior partner and composed a direct message to my father's primary inbox. I did not include a formal greeting. I did not offer any corporate pleasantries or false empathy. I typed a single, definitive line of text. Emergency shareholder meeting granted. This Friday at 10 in the morning, main boardroom. I will be there in person. I clicked send. The stage was officially set for the collision of two lives. The family that discarded me was about to open their front door and invite the storm inside. Friday morning broke over the Boston skyline with a sharp, piercing clarity. The tension hovering over the city resembled a drawn bowstring, pulled back to its maximum limit and ready to snap. My family did not just request a meeting to discuss their dwindling finances. Richard and Evelyn Alice constructed an elaborate theater of psychological warfare. During my 6 grueling years running their supply chain, I learned exactly how my parents neutralized perceived threats. They never fought their battles in private rooms. They weaponized audiences. They relied on public humiliation to force their opponents into submission. Today, they intended to formally accuse Apex Solutions of gross mismanagement. They planned to intimidate the mystery chief executive officer into backing down, restoring their frozen credit cards, and returning their stolen power. To execute this specific trap, my father invited his 3 largest private investors to the corporate headquarters. I watched the live security feed from a tablet resting on the passenger seat of my car. Marcus Thorne, a ruthless venture capitalist who poured millions into the initial brand expansion, sat near the head of the long glass table. Beside him sat Sylvia Grant and William Caldwell, 2 legacy stakeholders who cared only about the steady rhythm of their quarterly dividends. My parents also summoned a handful of high-ranking relatives, including my Uncle Thomas, who held a minor board seat and thrived on creating corporate drama. Richard even hired 2 external litigators who sat in the corner, shuffling stacks of printed legal precedents. My family packed the room with spectators to witness the summary execution of a rogue consultant. The visual contrast displayed on my glowing screen painted a stunning portrait of deep delusion. My family arrived dressed in their most intimidating designer wardrobes. Evelyn wore a pristine white Chanel suit radiating a false sense of untouchable elegance. Richard sported a bespoke charcoal pinstripe tailored to project unbreakable authority. Julian sat next to them, wearing a smug smirk and a solid gold Rolex watch he bought with embezzled vendor funds. They were dripping in the very wealth I was preparing to repossess. They sat in those ergonomic leather chairs whispering confident predictions to the investors. They remained entirely unaware of a crucial architectural detail. 5 minutes prior to the scheduled start time, I instructed building security to engage the electronic deadbolts. The heavy mahogany doors were now locked from the outside. The predators thought they were waiting for their prey to walk into an ambush. They did not realize they were sitting inside a sealed cage. I turned my attention away from the tablet and shifted my sleek black Mercedes into drive. I bypassed the visitor lot and steered directly toward the restricted executive parking structure. The tires hummed against the smooth concrete as I navigated the winding ramps. I pulled into the designated chief executive officer space. It was the exact painted rectangle where Julian had forced me to surrender my corporate keys 5 years prior. I turned off the engine. The quiet purr of the luxury vehicle faded into total silence. I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the cool air fill my lungs. My hands rested on the leather steering wheel. They were steady and calm. Not a single tremor betrayed my pulse. I thought about the terrified 28-year-old girl standing in the freezing rain holding a soggy cardboard box. That girl died on the pavement outside the country club. She was replaced by the woman staring back at me in the mirror. I adjusted the lapels of my tailored navy blazer. I was no longer the sacrificial lamb of the Alice family. I was the storm they had desperately begged to save them. I stepped out of the car and grabbed my leather briefcase. The crisp autumn air felt electric against my skin as I walked toward the entrance. I pushed through the revolving glass doors of the main lobby. The new receptionist, a young woman hired during my exile, looked up with a bewildered expression as I bypassed the visitor log. She opened her mouth to ask for my identification, but my purposeful stride silenced her question. I walked directly toward the private elevator reserved exclusively for board members. I swiped my master digital keycard across the black sensor. The steel doors glided open, carrying me upward toward the executive floor. The elevator ride lasted exactly 30 seconds. I used that half minute to compartmentalize any lingering traces of familial obligation. There were no parents waiting for me on the top floor. There was only a failing retail chain drowning in unpayable debt. There was only a brother who stole millions to fund his ego, and a mother who blamed an innocent daughter to protect a guilty son. They chose this battlefield when they launched their smear campaign. I was simply arriving to finish the war. The elevator chimed, announcing my arrival. The doors parted, revealing the sprawling layout of the top level. The plush carpet absorbed the sound of my footsteps as I walked past the empty cubicles. The office purge I executed earlier in the week left the surrounding workspaces looking like a barren wasteland. I walked past Julian Old corner office, noting the bare walls and the missing mahogany desk. The quiet emptiness served as a perfect prelude to the crowded room ahead. I approached the boardroom. I could hear my father's booming voice filtering through the thick wood. He was assuring Marcus Thorne that the rogue consulting firm would be disciplined, dismissed, and replaced by the end of the business day. He promised the investors that the temporary cash flow disruption was a minor hurdle. I placed both hands on the cool brass handles of the double doors. The electronic deadbolts recognized my proximity badge and disengaged with a soft metallic click. I gripped the handles firmly. The trap was fully set. The audience was seated, and the golden boy was about to face his final reckoning. I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped straight into the light. The heavy mahogany doors yielded to my push. I stepped over the threshold and entered the boardroom. The air inside felt thick and stagnant, carrying the distinct scent of expensive leather-polished wood and stale espresso. A dozen overlapping voices had been echoing off the soundproof walls just a second prior. My father was mid-sentence, delivering a rehearsed speech about fiscal responsibility and temporary liquidity hurdles to his captive audience. He was gesturing expansively with his right hand, projecting the false confidence of a man who believed his own lies. The moment my tailored navy blazer crossed into their collective line of sight, the chorus of voices died. The sudden silence that followed was not merely an absence of noise. It was a tangible, heavy presence pressing down on the room. It was the face crack of the century unfolding in real time. I stood near the entrance, allowing the occupants a few crucial seconds to process the visual impossibility standing before them. The human brain requires a moment to catch up when reality shatters an established delusion. My father, Richard, sat frozen at the head of the long glass table. His mouth hung open, forming a silent protest. The rehearsed corporate jargon died on his tongue. For a fraction of a second, the polished facade of the untouchable chief executive melted away, leaving behind a confused, vulnerable old man staring at a ghost. His fingers went slack. The heavy silver Mont Blanc pen he had been twirling slipped from his grasp. The metal cylinder hit the tempered glass surface with a sharp, audible clatter. It rolled 2 feet across the transparent table before coming to a rest near a stack of printed legal documents. That single, solitary sound served as the starting gun for the reckoning. Confusion rapidly morphed into indignation. Richard placed both palms flat against the cool glass and pushed himself up from his ergonomic leather chair. His face flushed a dark crimson shade. He looked past my shoulder toward the empty hallway, expecting to see a trailing security detail or a panicked receptionist running to apologize for the breach. "Anthea," he barked. His voice carried the same sharp, reprimanding tone he used when I was a teenager missing curfew, or a young executive questioning his vendor choices. "What on earth are you doing here? Building security has strict orders to keep former employees off this floor. You are interrupting a highly sensitive private shareholder meeting. We do not have time for your childish disruptions." I did not flinch. I did not blink. I maintained steady, unwavering eye contact with the man who had exiled me. Before I could formulate a response, my brother decided to insert himself into the narrative. Julian slouched in his seat to the right of our father. He crossed his arms over his chest and let out a derisive scoff. His tailored suit hung slightly loose on his frame, a subtle physical indicator of the stress he had endured over the past week of declined cards and repossessed furniture. Yet his arrogance remained intact. Julian had spent his entire life shielded from the consequences of his own actions. Our parents built a protective bubble around his fragile ego, ensuring he never had to apologize or explain his failures. That lifetime of coddling produced a man who believed every room he entered belonged to him by divine right. "Did you run out of money?" Julian sneered. A cruel, crooked smile twisted his lips. He leaned back in his chair, projecting an air of extreme inconvenience. "Is that why you showed up unannounced? Do you need a handout to pay rent on your little apartment? Because your timing is terrible. We are in the middle of a high-level negotiation with Apex Solutions to fix a temporary cash flow issue. We do not have the patience for your drama today. Get out before I have you physically removed." The blind audacity of his words hung in the quiet room. Marcus Thorne, the lead private investor, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The other legacy stakeholders, Sylvia Grant and William Caldwell, exchanged nervous glances. They were wealthy, calculating individuals who did not appreciate family dysfunction interrupting their profit margins. They watched the exchange, waiting to see how the Alice patriarch would handle the intrusion. They assumed this was merely a pathetic display from a disgruntled relative seeking a handout. They expected me to wither. They expected the disgraced daughter to lower her gaze, offer a stuttering apology, and retreat into the hallway in shame. They thought the old psychological triggers would still work perfectly. They were operating under outdated software. I kept my expression neutral. I did not raise my voice to match my brother's frantic pitch. I did not offer a defensive counter-argument to validate his insults. I simply began walking. My low heels clicked rhythmically against the polished hardwood floor framing the edges of the room. I bypassed the empty chairs near the door. I walked past the 2 external litigators who were staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes, clutching their legal pads like shields. I moved with the slow, deliberate pacing of a predator that has already secured the perimeter of the trap. I ignored my brother's taunts. I ignored the confused stares of the investors. I walked directly toward the head of the table. Richard instinctually took a half-step backward as I approached his vacated seat. The physical retreat was a minor concession, but a monumental shift in our lifelong dynamic. I placed my leather briefcase onto the glass surface right next to his dropped silver pen. The soft thud of the leather meeting the glass finalized my arrival and anchored my presence in the room. I turned my body and focused my entire attention on my mother. Evelyn Alice sat frozen in the chair to the left. She wore her pristine white Chanel suit, but her posture lacked its usual rigid elegance. She looked remarkably small. Her eyes were wide and frantic, darting between my calm face and the locked double doors. She was the architect of the vicious smear campaign currently circulating through our extended family. She was the woman who claimed I stole millions to protect her golden boy. She was the matriarch who taught me that love was conditional and highly transactional. I looked directly into her terrified eyes. I kept my voice low, calm, and surgically precise. It cut through the stagnant air like a scalpel separating tissue from bone. "I know you are waiting for a meeting with the Apex Chief Executive Julian," I said, without breaking eye contact with my mother. I slowly shifted my gaze to my brother. The cruel smirk on his face faltered slightly. He sat up straighter, sensing a distinct drop in the atmospheric pressure of the room. He uncrossed his arms. "I am Anthea Alice," I stated. "I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of Apex Solutions. That restructuring firm is my company. I built it from the ground up after you left me on the sidewalk." The remaining oxygen seemed to vanish from the room. I let the declaration settle into the quiet space. I watched the cognitive dissonance ravage their expressions. The human brain struggles to reconcile two opposing truths simultaneously. They were looking at the sister they deemed a pathetic failure while hearing the title of the corporate savior they had begged for salvation. They were trying to merge the victim they discarded with the predator who currently held their leash. I placed both of my hands on the high back of the leather chair at the head of the table, claiming the physical symbol of leadership. And as of last Tuesday morning, I continued my tone, devoid of any familial warmth or hesitation. I own the controlling operational rights to your entire lives. The physical reaction was immediate and profound. The color drained from Julian's face so fast it mimicked the onset of medical shock. His jaw slacked. The arrogant posture dissolved, leaving him slumped and vulnerable in his expensive suit. Evelyn covered her mouth with a trembling manicured hand, letting out a sharp, choked gasp that sounded like a sob. Richard stood paralyzed. He looked down at the signed operational surrender contract sitting in his own open portfolio, and then looked back up at my face. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. They had not hired a faceless corporate entity to rescue their sinking ship. They had willingly handed the deed to their kingdom, the unlimited access to their bank accounts, and the final say over their legacy to the exact person they threw out in the freezing rain 5 years ago. They had funded their own executioner. Marcus Thorne, the lead investor, leaned forward, resting his elbows on the glass table. His eyes darted between my steady posture and my father's pale, sweating forehead. The veteran venture capitalist possessed an uncanny ability to read the shifting tides of power. He realized instantly that the Alice family was no longer in charge of their own destiny. He realized the quiet, calm woman standing at the head of the table held all the winning cards. Richard finally found his voice. It was a weak, reedy sound, stripped of its usual booming authority. He pointed a shaking finger at me, preparing to launch a desperate, defensive counterattack. He was going to deny my authority and try to spin the narrative back in his favor. He was going to tell the investors that this was a sick joke and demand my immediate removal. But I was not there to debate the validity of my ironclad contract. I was there to present the undeniable receipts, and the digital execution I prepared on my secure server was ready to be projected onto the boardroom wall, exposing every single lie they had ever told. Richard stood at the head of the long glass table with his chest heaving under his bespoke charcoal suit. He raised a trembling finger and pointed it directly at my face. "This is a sick joke," Richard declared. His voice cracked under the immense strain of his own rising panic. He turned toward Marcus Thorne and the other wealthy stakeholders sitting along the perimeter of the room. "Do not listen to a single word she says. She is lying to you. Anthea is a failed data entry clerk we fired 5 years ago for gross incompetence. She harbors a petty grudge and hacked our scheduling system to orchestrate this ridiculous stunt." Marcus Thorne narrowed his eyes. The seasoned venture capitalist did not look convinced by the frantic outburst. He shifted his piercing gaze between my sweating father and my perfectly calm posture. Denial serves as the primary defense mechanism of a narcissist. When faced with an irrefutable reality they cannot manipulate, toxic individuals will always attempt to discredit the messenger. My father built his entire retail empire on optics and charm. He operated under the dangerous delusion that if he spoke with enough unwavering authority, the world would simply bend to fit his version of the truth. He spent decades manipulating suppliers and soothing anxious commercial bankers with a firm handshake and an expensive dinner. He believed his title granted him immunity from consequence. I did not offer a defensive rebuttal. Arguing with a delusion only validates the premise of the argument. You never waste your breath debating a cornered liar when you hold the undeniable receipts. I reached into the front pocket of my tailored navy blazer and retrieved a small black presentation remote. I pointed the sleek device toward the ceiling-mounted audio-visual system. I pressed the center button. A low mechanical hum vibrated through the tense silence of the boardroom. The motorized projection screen descended slowly from the hidden ceiling panel behind my father. A beam of crisp white light shot from the projector lens, cutting across the length of the glass table. A towering high-definition spreadsheet illuminated the blank screen. The document displayed an intricate mosaic of financial rows, columns, and highlighted target cells. I titled the presentation, "The Julian Audit." The bold black text hovered directly above my father's head like a digital guillotine waiting to drop. I stepped away from the chairs and walked toward the projected image. I turned to face the captive audience. "This is the Julian Audit," I announced. My voice remained even and surgically detached. I compiled this forensic accounting dossier using the unrestricted server access my firm secured last week. It tracks every single outgoing wire transfer, corporate credit swipe, and payroll anomaly executed since the leadership transition 5 years ago. I pressed the forward arrow on my remote. The screen zoomed in on a specific cluster of data, highlighted in vivid red ink. "Let us begin with line item 412, I instructed the room. The investors leaned forward in their ergonomic chairs. Marcus Thorne pulled a pair of silver reading glasses from his breast pocket, unfolding them with deliberate care. I directed my green laser pointer at the glowing red row. In the third quarter of his first year as chief executive, Julian authorized a disbursement of $120,000, I explained. He categorized the transaction under strategic marketing outreach. However, the routing number did not belong to a public relations agency or a media buying firm. The funds were wired directly to a luxury European auto dealership downtown. Julian used your investor capital to purchase a custom Porsche. A sharp intake of breath echoed from the left side of the table. Sylvia Grant clutched her leather portfolio tightly against her chest. William Caldwell shifted his posture, his jaw tightening with visible anger. Julian slumped in his seat. The arrogant sneer he wore just moments prior melted into a mask of pure terror. He opened his mouth to formulate a plausible excuse, but the sheer, crushing weight of the projected evidence smothered the words before they could materialize. The golden boy was suffocating under the numbers. I advanced the slide. The projected image shifted to a detailed expense report spanning a 2-week period from the previous spring. Here we have $80,000 allocated to international vendor research. I continued, guiding the bright dot across the screen. These charges include chartered private flights, a penthouse suite at a 5-star hotel, and extensive spa treatments in Milan. The receipts were submitted by Julian, but the signature belongs to his wife, Jessica. She holds no official title within Alice Heritage Goods. She spent your corporate dividends on a luxury vacation while the warehouse distribution team was denied their annual cost of living wages. The dynamic inside the boardroom shifted rapidly, from stunned disbelief to palpable hostility. The wealthy stakeholders did not care about our family drama or my bruised feelings. They cared exclusively about their money. Watching their personal investments fund a designer shopping spree ignited a distinct ruthless fury in their eyes. I was not finished. The final phase of the audit targeted the most egregious violation of their trust. I clicked the remote one last time. A categorized list of 20 unfamiliar names populated the projector screen. During my tenure running the supply chain, I fought for every single dollar in the operating budget, I told the room. I was punished for minor accounting discrepancies and reprimanded for standard shipping delays. My brother faced a vastly different set of rules. When he required more cash than his generous salary provided, he simply invented new staff members. I swept the laser across the long list of names. These are ghost employees, I stated clearly. They possess fabricated Social Security numbers and non-existent home addresses. Julian generated these phantom profiles in the Human Resources database. Every 2 weeks, the payroll department issued 20 separate direct deposits. Those funds bypassed the standard corporate banking channels and funneled straight into a private offshore holding account registered directly to Julian Alice. The silence following that revelation was deafening. Embezzling through fake payroll accounts crossed the line from poor management into deliberate federal wire fraud. The two external litigators sitting in the corner stopped shuffling their printed legal precedents. They stared at the bright screen, realizing they were sitting in a room defending a man bound for federal prison. I turned away from the spreadsheet and locked eyes with my mother. Evelyn gripped the edge of the glass table so hard her knuckles turned a translucent white. Her pristine Chanel suit offered no protection against the chilling reality of her own complicity. Over the past 48 hours, Richard and Evelyn launched a targeted smear campaign, I said. My tone grew sharp, matching the severity of their treacherous behavior. They contacted our extended family and your primary stakeholders, claiming their former operations manager stole millions from the corporate reserves. They needed a scapegoat to explain their impending bankruptcy. They were willing to frame their own daughter for a felony to hide the truth. I pointed the laser directly at the final bold number resting at the bottom of the spreadsheet. While Richard and Evelyn Alice were telling the family that I stole from them, I announced, pointing to the glowing digits, Julian was actively embezzling $2.4 million of investor capital, and he executed this sustained long-term fraud while fully enabled by a mother and father who willfully refused to look at a single ledger. The trap snapped completely shut. The investors turned their heads, slowly shifting their collective hostile gaze from the projected evidence to the Alice family. The expressions on the faces of Marcus, Sylvia, and William hardened into absolute, unadulterated fury. The predators were now surrounded by a pack of hungry wolves. Richard looked at Marcus, raising his hands in a frantic, pleading gesture. "Marcus, I swear we had no idea," he stammered. The external firm handled the accounting. Julian told us the margins were tight due to global supply chain issues. You have to believe we were in the dark. Marcus Thorne slammed his open palm onto the glass table. The sudden forceful noise made my mother physically flinch. "Do not insult my intelligence, Richard," the veteran venture capitalist growled. "You are the chairman of the board. You signed the quarterly disclosures. You either knew your son was stealing our money, or you were too incompetent to run a retail kiosk. Both scenarios end with you losing everything." My family was trapped in a cage constructed entirely of their own receipts. The pristine illusion of the Alice retail empire laid in shattered pieces across the boardroom floor. The harsh fluorescent lights reflected off the terrified sweat pooling on my brother's forehead. The corporate execution was flawless. But toxic individuals possess a highly predictable survival instinct. When anger, denial, and intimidation fail to protect them, they pivot immediately to their final defensive strategy. They deploy weaponized vulnerability. As the furious investors glared at them, I watched my mother transform. Evelyn inhaled a shaky, ragged breath. Her eyes brimmed with sudden manufactured tears. She prepared to launch a desperate emotional performance designed to manipulate the narrative and force me into submission. She thought a mother crying in front of an audience could erase $2.4 million of stolen reality. The backpedal was about to begin. When hostility proves ineffective, toxic individuals instinctively pivot toward a different psychological arsenal. They abandon their dominant posture and deploy weaponized vulnerability. As the furious stares of the venture capitalist bore into my parents the reality of their situation finally breached their defenses. The projected spreadsheet containing evidence of severe financial fraud hung above them like a digital judge delivering a guilty verdict. My father, Richard, stood, paralyzed by the exposure. He possessed no contingency plan for undeniable truth. His entire empire was built on confident illusions, and those illusions lay shattered across the polished hardwood floor. My mother, Evelyn, however, relied on a separate set of survival instincts. During my childhood, I witnessed her unique talent for producing tears on command. She utilized weeping as a highly calculated strategic tool. If a landscape architect delayed a renovation at our summer estate, she cried until he offered a substantial discount. If my father resisted funding another lavish country club gala, her eyes welled up until he surrendered his checkbook to soothe her distress. She viewed sorrow as a valid currency. She believed her distress required immediate external soothing. Watching her transition from a haughty matriarch into a fragile victim required only seconds. The cold realization that her elite social status was evaporating caused genuine panic to flood her nervous system. Her breathing grew shallow and erratic. Her perfectly applied mascara began to run, tracking dark lines down her pale cheeks. She pushed her chair backward. The metal legs scraped harshly against the floor, breaking the heavy quiet of the room. She bypassed my father and rushed around the edge of the long glass table, moving directly toward my position at the head of the boardroom. Her manicured hands reached out, trembling visibly under the bright fluorescent ceiling panels. She closed the physical distance between us, abandoning all pretenses of corporate decorum. "Anthea, honey, please." Her voice cracked, echoing loudly across the spacious room. She pitched her tone to sound incredibly small and helpless. "We are your family. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. You have to save us. You owe us for raising you." The sheer staggering audacity of those spoken sentences hung suspended in the chilled air. That was the pebble of this specific conflict. It was a small, concentrated moment of breathtaking entitlement. She demanded salvation by invoking a biological bond she had severed without hesitation half a decade ago. She demanded a return on the basic parental investment of providing childhood shelter. She expected me to prioritize her current comfort over my own survival. She assumed the deep conditioning of my youth remained intact. She thought I still craved her maternal approval, enough to hide her crimes. I did not step backward. I did not flinch or break eye contact. I refused to allow her grasping fingers to touch the fabric of my tailored blazer. I stood perfectly still, forcing her to halt her desperate advance just inches from my chest. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my smartphone. My thumb hovered over the glowing screen. With a single, deliberate tap, I altered the digital feed, sending a new image command to the ceiling-mounted projector. The meticulous financial spreadsheet detailing the embezzlement vanished. A massive, high-resolution screenshot replaced the ledger on the stark white wall. It was the social media post my cousin forwarded to me days earlier. The bright blue interface of the application magnified Evelyn's profile picture and the accompanying paragraphs of text she had written. I did not need to speak immediately. I let the audience read her own words. The investors leaned forward, squinting at the projected text. The message explicitly accused me of draining the corporate reserves. The paragraphs painted me as a vengeful, bitter thief who funneled millions of dollars into offshore shell companies right before being rightfully terminated. She told her vast network of wealthy friends that I was the sole reason the Alice family legacy faced a temporary cash flow crisis. She ended the public update by praising Julian for working tirelessly to clean up the catastrophic mess his sister left behind. The hypocrisy illuminated the room, casting a harsh glow over my weeping mother. Marcus Thorne adjusted his silver reading glasses, reading the projected lies line by line. The veteran investor scoffed audibly, shaking his head in profound disgust. Sylvia Grant covered her mouth, suppressing a gasp, as she connected the timeline of the public smear campaign with the private embezzlement audit I had just revealed. They realized my mother was actively framing an innocent woman to keep her guilty son out of a federal penitentiary. I leveled my gaze at the crying woman standing before me. The tears streaming down her face held no power here. "This is how you treat flesh and blood," I stated. My tone dropped into a dangerous calm register. It was quiet enough to force everyone in the room to hold their breath to hear the verdict. "You discarded me in the freezing rain." I continued enunciating every syllable with crisp precision. "You stole my professional credit for building this retail empire from scratch. You handed my operational successes to a man who spent his days playing golf. And when your willful ignorance finally caught up with you, you deliberately smeared my reputation across our entire extended network to cover for the crimes committed by your golden boy." Evelyn opened her mouth to interrupt, but a sharp inhale caught in her throat. Her outstretched hands slowly dropped to her sides. "I owe you exactly what you provided me when I possessed nothing," I declared. The finality in my voice echoed through the boardroom. Absolute silence. The truth paralyzed her. The maternal guilt trip disintegrated upon impact with reality. She took a staggering step backward, bumping into the edge of the glass table for physical support. Her attempt to manipulate the narrative failed spectacularly. She looked toward Richard for backup, but my father remained frozen, staring at the floor, unable to meet the furious gazes of his primary stakeholders. Before the heavy quiet could fully settle over the ruined family dynamic, Julian decided to intervene. His fragile ego could not withstand the public humiliation of his parents failing to shield him. He stammered frantically from his leather seat, attempting to salvage a situation that was already burned to ash. "There is a profound misunderstanding here," Anthea Julian pleaded, his voice pitched higher, betraying his rising terror. "We can explain the social media posts. My mother was emotional and confused by the missing funds. We can fix the internal accounting errors together. You are a consultant. We can draft a repayment schedule and handle this as a private family matter." He never finished the thought. Marcus Thorne raised a large, weathered hand, commanding total quiet. The lead investor possessed a face currently turning a deep, volatile shade of purple. The vein pulsing near his temple signaled an impending detonation. Marcus did not look at me or my parents. He focused his unblinking, predatory stare entirely on the sweating chief executive officer sitting across from him. The family dynamic was officially shattered beyond repair. The domestic disputes and the historical grievances no longer mattered to the people holding the purse strings. The corporate overlords were done listening to excuses. They were preparing to extract their pound of flesh, and the favorite son was sitting directly on the chopping block. Marcus Thorne did not become a billionaire by showing mercy or entertaining incompetence. He built his vast fortune in the technology sector during the late 90s by identifying weak leadership and excising it with surgical precision. He viewed corporate sentimentality as a lethal disease. The moment he comprehended the true depth of the embezzlement, his demeanor transformed. He did not yell. He did not pound his fists on the glass table. He stood up slowly from his ergonomic chair. The deliberate nature of his movement commanded the terrified attention of every single person in the room. Marcus leveled a single, steady finger directly at my brother. "You are done, Julian," he stated. His voice possessed the dense, crushing weight of a falling anvil. "You are entirely finished in this town and in this industry. I am calling the Securities and Exchange Commission the second I walk out of this building. I am dispatching my personal legal team to file a civil suit against you for defrauding your primary investors. You are going to a federal penitentiary, and I am going to strip you of every asset you claim to own to recoup my stolen capital." The consequences finally crashed down upon the golden boy. Julian went pale. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of gray. He physically backed away from the edge of the glass table, stumbling awkwardly against his expensive leather chair. His entire reality depended on the fragile illusion of his own brilliance. For 35 years, my parents shielded him from the fallout of his own profound mediocrity. When he crashed a sports car in college, my father bought the silence of the local police chief. When he failed his initial business ventures, my mother funded his lavish lifestyle and blamed his business partners. They taught him that rules applied exclusively to other people. Now, standing under the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom, he faced a relentless adversary. His parents could not bribe or charm. Richard stepped forward, breaking his own paralysis. The patriarch moved to physically shield his son. He placed his body between the towering venture capitalist and the cowering chief executive officer. "Marcus, please," Richard pleaded. His voice carried a pathetic, reedy desperation that I had never heard before. "Do not make any hasty calls to the federal authorities. We can restructure this debt internally. We can liquidate our private real estate portfolio to cover the missing capital. We will make you whole without involving the government." Marcus did not even blink. He stared at my father with unvarnished disgust. "You do not have a private real estate portfolio, Richard," the veteran investor corrected him. "Your primary residence and your summer estate in the Hamptons are heavily mortgaged to secure the commercial loans currently in default. You own nothing but crippling liabilities. You are a bankrupt man defending a common thief." Richard turned his frantic gaze toward me. He pointed a shaking, manicured hand in my direction. "Anthea can fix this," he promised. His eyes were wide and manic, searching my face for any sign of compliance. "She built that incredible audit on the projector screen. She runs a highly successful restructuring firm. Apex Solutions can step in and reorganize the payable accounts. She can save the company. We just need a few weeks to implement her strategies." The bitter irony of his desperate plea hung heavy in the quiet air. 10 minutes ago, I was a failed data entry clerk holding a petty grudge. He had just commanded me to leave the building. Now, I was the sole remaining life raft in a churning ocean of corporate debt. He expected me to dive into the freezing water to rescue the very people who threw me overboard 5 years ago. He expected my profound competence to serve as his ultimate shield. Before I could address my father's breathtaking hypocrisy, a soft, distinct sound fractured the thick tension in the room. It was the sharp click of the heavy brass door handle disengaging. I shifted my focus to the back of the boardroom. Jessica, my wife, was quietly slipping out the rear exit. This was the defining pebble of the current conflict. It was a tiny, subtle movement signaling a monumental structural collapse. Jessica grew up in a working-class neighborhood and spent her entire 20s hunting for a wealthy heir. She married Julian strictly for the prestige, the exclusive country club memberships, and the limitless corporate credit card. She tolerated his endless arrogance because it came with a penthouse suite and winter shopping trips to Monaco. Her loyalty was entirely transactional. The moment Marcus Thorne mentioned federal prison and asset forfeiture, her survival instinct activated. Jessica possessed no loyalty to a sinking ship. She understood the cold mathematics of the situation much better than my parents did. The stolen money was gone. The elite social status was permanently erased. The designer wardrobe she wore was likely destined for an auction block to satisfy the creditors. She slipped through the narrow opening of the heavy wooden doors without looking back. She did not say goodbye to her husband. She did not offer a single word of support to her devastated in-laws. The soft thud of the heavy door closing behind her echoed like a wooden gavel striking a sound block. Julian heard the heavy door shut. He turned his head and stared at the empty space where his wife had just been standing. A hollow, vacant realization washed over his features. The charming entourage he cultivated with stolen wealth had evaporated. He was entirely alone, facing the grim reality of his own actions. Marcus Thorne ignored the fleeing spouse. He ignored my father's frantic promises and empty guarantees. The ruthless investor turned his attention entirely to me. He evaluated my posture, my calm demeanor, and the flawless forensic accounting still displayed on the bright projector screen. He recognized a fellow apex predator in the room. He saw a patient, meticulous strategist who dismantled a $50 million retail empire without ever raising her voice. Ms. Alice Marcus said, addressing me with a newfound, profound respect, "Your consulting firm holds complete operational control over this corporate entity. You possess the binding legal authority to terminate executive personnel and liquidate assets at your own discretion." I offered a single, slow nod, confirming his accurate assessment. The terms of my contract were ironclad. "If Sylvia, William, and I force Richard and Julian out today," Marcus continued, his tone shifting from outright hostility to pure, calculated business logic, "if we vote to remove the toxic elements from this executive board right now, will Apex Solutions step in as permanent management? Will you assume the role of chief executive officer and salvage our remaining capital?" The expansive boardroom held its collective breath. The external litigators sitting in the corner lowered their legal pads, waiting in suspense for my response. Sylvia Grant and William Caldwell leaned forward in their chairs, their eyes fixed intensely on my face. The humming of the ceiling projector was the only sound permitted in the space. I looked at my family. Richard and Evelyn stared at me with wild, desperate hope. Their eyes were wide and pleading. The lifelong dynamic had inverted entirely. They were the helpless beggars standing in the rain, and I held the only keys to the fortified castle. If I said yes, I would become their ultimate savior. I possessed the leverage to negotiate a settlement with the wealthy investors, keeping Julian out of a federal penitentiary. I could restructure the suffocating debt over a decade to save my parents from humiliating personal bankruptcy. I could secure the prestigious Alice legacy they had spent 30 years building. Accepting the offer would grant me the ultimate traditional victory. I would occupy the highest seat in the retail empire. I would prove to the entire industry that I was the true visionary of the Alice bloodline. My parents would be forced to acknowledge my superiority for the rest of their natural lives. They would depend on my daily mercy for their monthly living stipends. I would win the exact game they designed to exclude me. The silence stretched, forming a heavy, suffocating blanket over the room. My mother clasped her manicured hands together under her chin, silently praying to a daughter she had recently crucified in public. My father held his breath, waiting for his reliable workhorse to step back into the familiar harness and pull their heavy wagon out of the mud. They assumed my deep childhood desire for their validation would override my vivid memory of their cruelty. They believed I came to this meeting to reclaim my rightful place at their long glass table. They had no idea I came to this building to burn their table to the ground. By accepting his terms, I could instantly command the retail empire my parents spent 3 decades building. I could seize the corner office. I could dictate the daily operations. I could transform my family into my permanent subordinates. I looked at Richard and Evelyn. My father stood with his shoulders slumped, his bespoke suit hanging awkwardly on his defeated frame. My mother sat with her manicured hands clasped tight under her chin, praying to a deity she only invoked when her bank accounts were threatened. They stared at me with wild, desperate hope. They expected me to step into the familiar role of the dutiful, reliable workhorse. Throughout my entire childhood, my worth was measured exclusively in utility. I was the silent engine hidden beneath the hood of the Alice family machine. I was expected to run flawlessly, without maintenance or praise, while Julian received standing ovations simply for existing. Every straight-A report card, every optimized supply chain route, every late-night vendor negotiation was met with a brief, dismissive nod from Richard. They conditioned me to crave their validation. They assumed that deep, buried hunger for their approval would compel me to rescue them now. They believed I would happily accept the heavy yoke just to hear them finally say they were proud of me. I shifted my gaze downward. The original Apex Solutions restructuring contract rested on the polished glass surface right next to my leather briefcase. The thick parchment paper contained the ironclad terms of their operational surrender. It bore my father's jagged signature in dark blue ink. I reached out. The boardroom fell so silent I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock. The investors watched my hand with predatory anticipation. Sylvia Grant held her breath. William Caldwell stopped tapping his gold pen against his notepad. They assumed I was reaching for a pen to sign the addendum. They expected a seamless transfer of power. My fingertips brushed the smooth surface of the contract. I picked up the heavy document, holding it firmly between both hands. This was the defining pebble of the conflict. I gripped the top edge of the parchment and pulled my wrists apart in one swift, decisive motion. The sharp, tearing sound echoed through the silent room like a cracking whip. It was a crisp, defining noise that severed the final remaining thread, tying me to the Alice bloodline. I tore the contract vertically from top to bottom. I placed the two shredded halves back onto the pristine glass table. I looked directly into the hardened eyes of Marcus Thorne. "No," I said. My voice was calm, level, and entirely devoid of hesitation. "Apex Solutions is withdrawing its services effective immediately," I continued, addressing the panel of investors. "We are terminating the engagement. This company is unsavable. The structural rot is too deep. The debts exceed the recoverable assets. Any further capital injection would be throwing good money into a burning furnace. I advise you to contact your federal litigators and begin the liquidation process." Marcus Thorne did not argue. The veteran venture capitalist slowly nodded his head. He recognized the cold, flawless logic of a fellow strategist. He accepted the loss of his initial investment because he respected the brutal math. He picked up his leather portfolio and began placing his documents inside, signaling the official end of the Alice retail legacy. The finality of my refusal shattered the fragile remaining composure of my mother. Evelyn let out a piercing, guttural shriek. "Anthea, you cannot do this," she screamed. Her voice echoed off the soundproof walls, scratching against the ears of everyone present. Her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "We will lose everything. The bank will take the primary estate. They will seize the summer house in Nantucket. They will auction the cars. We will have nothing left." Her hysteria revealed the hollow core of her soul. She did not cry for her son facing federal prison. She did not mourn the fractured relationship with her daughter. She wept exclusively for her material possessions. She cried for the country club memberships, the designer wardrobes, and the high society gala invitations. She was terrified of becoming ordinary. I looked at the weeping woman standing near the table. I felt no pity. I felt no lingering childhood obligation. I felt only a profound, sweeping liberation. "You already lost it," I replied coldly. My words cut through her hysterical sobbing. I swept my hand across the ruined boardroom. "You built your luxury empire on my spine. I carried the weight of this company for 6 years. I negotiated the margins. I managed the logistics. I kept your doors open while you played pretend. And when you decided you no longer needed the workhorse, you broke my spine and handed the keys to a thief." I turned my attention to my father. Richard stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. His jaw trembled. "You threw me away because you thought I lacked vision," I reminded him. My tone remained steady and lethal. "You chose a golden boy who utilized his grand vision to embezzle $2 million and run your life work into the ground." I leaned forward slightly, resting my palms near the shredded contract. "I did not come to this building today to save you," I stated. "I did not spend 5 years building my own firm just to return here and fix your catastrophic mistakes. I came here to formally introduce you to the consequences of your own actions." I reached down and grasped the handle of my leather briefcase. I lifted it from the glass table. The execution was complete. The trap was sprung. The receipts were verified, and the guilty parties were locked inside their own burning house. I turned my back on my family. As I took my first step toward the double doors, the physical toll of the reckoning manifested behind me. I heard a heavy, sickening thud. Richard collapsed backward into his ergonomic chair, the strength entirely leaving his legs. A ragged, defeated wheeze escaped his lungs as the reality of his total ruin crushed his chest. To my right, a frantic, high-pitched gasping sound filled the air. Julian was clutching the lapels of his tailored suit jacket, bending forward at the waist. He was hyperventilating. The walls of his lifelong protective bubble had popped, and the cold, unforgiving air of the real world was suffocating him. He was struggling to draw a breath as the phantom sirens of a federal indictment rang in his ears. I did not stop walking. I did not turn around to offer comfort or distribute parting insults. I pushed the heavy mahogany doors open and stepped out into the quiet, carpeted hallway. The investors were already pulling out their cellular phones, preparing to dial their legal teams and unleash a swarm of federal auditors upon the Alice estate. The corporate vultures were circling, eager to pick the carcass clean. I walked toward the private elevator holding my briefcase. The burden I carried for 3 decades was gone. The toxic system that required my subjugation was currently eating itself alive in the room behind me. My family was finally forced to pay their own tab, and they were bankrupt. The elevator chimed, welcoming me inside. The doors closed, sealing away the past. I pressed the button for the ground floor, preparing to step out into the bright city sunlight. But the collapse of a dynasty rarely stays confined to a single boardroom. When a failing system crashes, it sends shockwaves through the entire surrounding ecosystem, and the ripple effects of my final judgment were about to hit the very people Julian had victimized the most. I stepped out of the brass elevator and out into the crisp Boston air. The autumn wind carried the sharp scent of roasted nuts and vehicle exhaust. I did not pause to look up at the gleaming glass tower that housed my bloodline legacy. The towering structure was already a corporate tomb. Financial death moves with a terrifying, quiet velocity when the primary life support cord is severed. Marcus Thorne did not even wait to return to his private office before enacting his vengeance. He made the necessary phone calls from the quiet sanctuary of the back seat of his town car. Within 2 hours of my departure, the primary funding lines were officially frozen. The venture capitalists initiated an emergency legal injunction to halt all outbound capital transfers. They locked the remaining liquidity in an impenetrable vault. Alice Heritage Goods transitioned from a struggling luxury retailer into an insolvent shell before the sun dipped below the horizon. Richard spent decades cultivating relationships with commercial bankers using vintage scotch and expensive cigars. He operated under the assumption that those casual handshakes granted him a permanent shield against consequence. He learned a brutal lesson about the cold nature of transactional loyalty. When the lead investors filed their formal fraud grievances, the banking institutions scrambled to minimize their own risk exposure. The lenders called in the commercial mortgages the very next morning. My father had exactly 48 hours to produce $4 million. He possessed zero leverage and zero friends willing to lend him a single dime. On Wednesday afternoon, the holding company filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. They did not receive the dignity of a structured reorganization. The federal court ordered a total liquidation of the brand. The definitive pebble of this collapse arrived on my desk the following Monday. I was sipping green tea when my assistant handed me a freshly printed copy of the local financial journal. The front page featured a high-resolution photograph taken outside the corporate headquarters. 5 men wearing dark windbreakers with federal insignias printed on the back were carrying heavy plastic bins out of the lobby. The bins were filled to the brim with internal servers, accounting ledgers, and hard drives. The Securities and Exchange Commission had secured a judicial warrant. The digital forensic teams were preparing to verify the exact same audit I projected onto the boardroom wall. Julian was placed under immediate federal investigation for wire fraud and criminal embezzlement. The government seized his passport and froze his personal checking accounts. The golden boy, who spent his entire adult life insulated by parental wealth, suddenly faced the sterile, unforgiving machinery of the justice system. He was forced to hire an exhausted public defender because the Alice estate could no longer afford private legal counsel. The charming smile that once secured him country club invitations held no sway over a federal prosecutor building a slam-dunk case based on undeniable bank routing numbers. The romantic fallout was even swifter than the financial ruin. Jessica possessed a survival instinct honed by years of climbing the ruthless social ladder. She treated her marriage as a highly lucrative contract, and Julian had just breached the primary terms. The morning the federal authorities seized their shared penthouse, she filed for divorce. She packed her designer luggage and relocated into a boutique hotel across town, leaving her husband to face the prosecutors alone. She did not attend his preliminary hearings or offer public statements of support. She simply vanished, seeking a new host to fund her lavish lifestyle. Julie Lang was left sitting in a stark interrogation room, stripped of his custom suits, his stolen wealth, and his fawning audience. The collapse of Richard and Evelyn Alice was a slow, agonizing descent into permanent obscurity. High society operates on a strict, unspoken code. You can be cruel and you can be arrogant, but you can never be bankrupt. The moment the federal raid hit the news cycle, their elite social circle severed all ties with terrifying speed. The country club quietly revoked their membership, citing a morality clause and unpaid dues. The prestigious charity gala committees removed Evelyn from their planning boards overnight. The thick, embossed invitations to summer cocktail parties stopped arriving in the mail. They became social pariahs in the exact circles they once ruled. The bank foreclosed on the sprawling estate they had prized over their own daughter. The grand brick mansion with the manicured lawns and the circular driveway was auctioned to satisfy the angry creditors. The pristine summer house in Nantucket followed a week later. My parents were forced to downsize to a rented two-bedroom condominium located on the dreary industrial outskirts of the city. The sensory shock of poverty broke my mother. The woman who once fired a landscaper for planting the wrong shade of hydrangeas was now sharing a communal laundry room with her neighbors. The patriarch who commanded boardrooms full of frightened executives was now riding the public bus to meet with his assigned bankruptcy trustee. Their social standing was obliterated. They traded their capable daughter for a thief, and the thief cost them their kingdom. But true victory does not end with simply watching an enemy fall. If I walked away and left a vacuum, I would be punishing the innocent people caught in the crossfire. The Alice Heritage Goods corporate office employed 50 dedicated workers. These were the logistics coordinators, the warehouse foremen, and the inventory specialists who kept the machine running, while Julian played golf. They possessed mortgages to pay and medical bills to cover. They did not deserve to lose their livelihoods due to the staggering greed of the executive suite. 2 days after the bankruptcy filing went public, I instructed my human resources director to contact every single member of the former operations team. I bypassed the bloated middle management layer and targeted the actual worker bees. I offered them immediate placement within Apex Solutions. I matched their previous salaries and added a 20% increase across the board. I provided comprehensive medical benefits and full stock options. The response was overwhelming. Within a week, my firm absorbed the sharpest, most dedicated talent from the ashes of my family business. The people who actually understood the retail supply chain now worked directly for me. We secured a much larger commercial office space to accommodate the rapid expansion. The employees who once watched my brother humiliate me in front of the entire company now sat in bright, ergonomic workspaces funded by my success. They offered me a fierce, unyielding loyalty because I rewarded their hard work with tangible security instead of empty corporate buzzwords. I took their best personnel. I secured the trust of their primary investors. I absorbed their future and folded it into my own growing empire. I left Richard, Evelyn, and Julian with the exact reward they earned over a lifetime of the trail. They possessed a seemingly endless supply of silence and the crushing weight of their own choices. The physical battle was over, but the psychological resolution remained. Sitting in my spacious corner office, watching the city lights flicker to life against the evening sky, I found myself staring at a single framed item resting on my desk. It was not a university diploma or an industry award. It was a stark, physical reminder of the exact night I chose my own survival over their highly conditional love. Today I sit in my spacious corner office, looking out through floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Boston skyline. The autumn sun reflects off the surrounding glass towers, casting long, golden shadows across the busy streets below. My firm, Apex Solutions, occupies the top 3 floors of this building. We employ over 100 brilliant strategists, analysts, and logistics experts. Many of them are the very same people my family once took for granted. The hum of productivity echoes through the corridors. It is a steady, comforting sound, born of mutual respect and hard-earned security. My mahogany desk is pristine. I do not clutter my workspace with useless vanity awards or hollow corporate trophies. I keep only one personal item on the smooth, polished wood. It is a small, rectangular frame forged from brushed steel. Inside the glass rests a faded, crumpled piece of thermal paper. It is a bank receipt for $43. That tiny slip of paper represents the cost of the rideshare I took 5 years ago. It is the exact receipt from the night my parents fired me and threw me out into the freezing rain. I kept it to remember the precise moment I hit the pavement holding a soggy cardboard box. I kept it to remember the terror of having nothing and the sheer liberating clarity of realizing I owed those people nothing in return. That receipt is my pebble. It is the foundational stone upon which I built this entire empire. The truth of what happened to the Alice family is not a story of a vindictive daughter plotting revenge. It is a story of inevitable structural collapse. In clinical therapy, the dynamic my parents fostered is called narcissistic scapegoating. It is a brutal form of emotional and financial abuse hidden behind country club memberships and tailored suits. A toxic family system functions exactly like a parasitic organism. It requires a dedicated beast of burden to carry the weight, to do the silent, invisible labor so the chosen golden child can shine in the sunlight. For 3 decades, I was the designated beast of burden. I was the reliable engine running in the dark while Julian stood on the podium accepting the medals. My parents required my extreme competence to fund their illusion of superiority. They needed my 80-hour work weeks to pay for their luxurious vacations and expensive social habits. But a parasitic system possesses a fatal flaw. When the host finally realizes her own worth and walks away, the parasite starves. The moment my parents severed my employment to protect Julian's fragile ego, they signed their own death warrant. They removed the only load-bearing pillar holding up their crumbling roof. When the burden leaves, the system starves and turns on itself. Julian was suddenly forced to actually manage the logistics I handled for years. He possessed no skills, no discipline, and no vision. He panicked and resorted to theft to maintain his unearned status. Richard and Evelyn were forced to confront the decaying ledgers, but they chose willful ignorance over accountability. They enabled the rot until the floor gave way beneath their feet. I did not destroy Alice Heritage Goods. The Alice family destroyed themselves. I simply provided the mirror they spent their entire lives running away from. I never spoke to my parents or my brother again after I walked out of that locked boardroom. I did not attend the subsequent federal hearings where Julian faced the prosecutors. I did not answer the frantic letters my mother sent from her new, cramped rental unit, pleading for a financial stipend. I instructed my legal team to return all correspondence unopened. The silence I weaponized in my freezing studio apartment 5 years ago remains my primary defense today. I offer them no access to my energy, my wealth, or my peace. I still hear the whispers, of course. The Boston social circles are small and gossip travels fast. A distant cousin recently reached out, attempting to play the role of peacemaker. She told me that Richard and Evelyn still play the victim to anyone who will listen. They sit in their small condominium drinking cheap wine and telling fabricated stories about my betrayal. They claim I am a cruel, ungrateful daughter who orchestrated their downfall out of sheer spite. They tell their few remaining acquaintances that I stole their legacy and left them destitute. They still refuse to acknowledge the $2 million Julianne embezzled. They refuse to take accountability for the warehouse workers they starved or the vendors they ruined. They prefer the comfort of a fabricated tragedy over the harsh light of their own failures. I let them talk. Their opinions no longer carry any currency in my world. The words of bankrupt abusers hold no power over a woman who signs her own paychecks. Setting strict boundaries is not an act of betrayal. Refusing to be exploited is not a crime. Society often pressures the scapegoat to forgive and forget, urging us to keep the peace at the expense of our own sanity. We are told that blood is thicker than water, and that family demands unconditional loyalty. But loyalty must be earned through mutual respect, not extracted through manipulation. If your family treats you like a resource instead of a human being, you owe them nothing. Letting a burning house burn to the ground is not arson. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep toxic people warm. If they look at your hard work and call you a failure, let them. Let them underestimate your brilliance. Let them push you out into the rain. Use their doubt as the mortar for your foundation. Take every insult, every slight, and every moment of calculated cruelty and turn them into bricks. Build an empire so vast, so undeniable, and so resilient that one day they have to beg at your gates just to survive. And when they finally arrive at your door expecting the obedient servant they used to know, you will have the profound pleasure of handing them the consequences of their own actions. The journey from the scapegoat to the chief executive officer is not an easy path. It requires walking through the dark alone. It requires mourning the family you deserved, but never actually had. But the view from the other side is worth every single tear. The peace of an authentic life, free from manipulation, is the greatest wealth a person can ever acquire. If you have made it this far into my story, I want to ask you a question. I know I am not the only person who has carried the weight of a broken family. I know there are others out there working in the shadows while someone else claims the credit. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic system to save yourself? Have you ever packed your bags, left the drama behind, and chosen your own peace over their constant demands? Tell me your story in the comments below. Share your triumphs and your struggles. I read every single one because your courage inspires me to keep building. Remember this above all else. You are not the label they forced upon you. You are not a burden. You are not a failure. You are stronger than the false narrative they wrote for you. You own the pen now. Go write your own ending.
We live in a complex world, particularly within the framework of traditional American family culture, where the definition of success is often drawn with rigid, unforgiving lines that leave little room for individual discovery. From the narrative we have just explored, several profound messages surface regarding the delicate, often fractured dynamic between parents and their children. The most glaring and immediate lesson is the immense danger of assigning premature verdicts on a child's life. We must understand that parents should never label children as failures too early in their journey. It is a painfully common misstep for well-meaning families to evaluate their children's ultimate potential based entirely on fleeting, short-term achievements. Perhaps a disappointing semester of college grades, a stumbling first job, or an initial income that falls drastically short of societal expectations. However, the message here is undeniable. Human growth simply does not follow a fixed, predictable path. A son or daughter who is casually dismissed and considered a failure today might actually be quietly developing their skills, their resilience, and their worldview in their own unique way, entirely out of sight from those who judge them the most harshly. When families fall into the trap of expectant pressure, the resulting emotional friction possesses the devastating power to break family relationships entirely. There is a distinct, lingering tragedy in a family cutting off or rejecting a child for failing to meet a predetermined set of expectations, as it reveals a type of education and parenting approach that prioritizes outward achievement over unconditional affection. The underlying message we must internalize is that parental love should never be conditional. When children are made to feel rejected and unworthy of their own family's embrace, they will eventually choose to walk away and leave. They do not make this agonizing choice because they are weak or incapable of handling the pressures of the world, but rather because they possess a fundamental human need to be respected. In the quiet, lonely aftermath of this separation, we witness another profound truth. A child's eventual triumph and success absolutely does not need initial recognition from their family in order to be valid. As demonstrated by the character in the story, it is entirely possible to build a formidable life and achieve massive success entirely without the safety net of family support. The critical message here is that a child's inherent value does not depend on whether their parents have the capacity to see it or not. Parents are profoundly challenged to learn how to trust their children's potential and inner drive long before they ever see the tangible, monetary results of their labor. This realization brings us to the difficult concept of humility and the sobering truth that parents can be, and often are, completely wrong. The climactic moment in the narrative, when the family is left entirely shocked upon finally learning the truth about the child they discarded, serves as a vital lesson about the blinding nature of parental ego. The undeniable message is that parents are not always right, and assuming infallibility only widens the generational divide. A truly good education and a healthy upbringing require two-way listening and mutual understanding, not simply imposing one's will upon another individual. Furthermore, the ultimate goal of raising a child should be fostering independence instead of maintaining perpetual control. Despite facing the immense, silencing pain of familial rejection, the character in the story successfully builds their own life and achieves undeniable success on their own terms. The takeaway is that good parenting and education are meant to help children become strong enough to stand confidently on their own 2 feet, rather than remaining forever dependent on their family's approval, direction, or resources. To achieve this level of mutual respect, society must actively unlearn the habit of only looking at the traditional path to fulfillment. In many traditional families, including those deeply rooted in the United States, a stubborn mindset persists which dictates that children must study a stable field and walk a thoroughly safe, predictable path to ensure a good life. Yet the resonant message of the narrative is that every single child has their own unique path to walk. Forcing children into a rigid, precast mold does not guarantee safety. Instead, it can lead to unnecessary failure, stifled potential, and deep-seated resentment. Even when these devastating familial fractures occur, the narrative offers a glimmer of hope through the possibility of a second chance in family relationships. The story opens the door to the potential for reconciliation after the undeniable truth of the child's success and inherent worth is finally revealed to the blinded parents. The hopeful message is that it is never too late to correct parenting mistakes, to apologize, and to bridge the divides we have created. However, this grace does not come without a heavy, heartbreaking toll. The price to pay for these mistakes can be years of painful separation and lost memories that can never be recovered. Ultimately, the core conclusion we must draw from this emotional journey is that a child does not need perfect parents. Instead, they desperately need parents who inherently trust them, who are endlessly patient with their unique timeline, and who absolutely do not give up on them too soon. If this journey resonated with you, if you have ever felt the crushing weight of conditional love, or the quiet, solitary triumph of proving your own worth in the dark, please subscribe to Sophia Told Stories for more narratives that explore the deep, unspoken truths of our lives. We spend so much of our youth waiting for the people who broke us to finally recognize our worth, only to eventually realize that our truest validation was always waiting on the other side of their letting go. Perhaps the empty spaces they left behind weren't voids meant to break us, but rather the exact amount of room we needed to finally grow into ourselves.